on Consumer Protection and Commerce will now come to order. The chair now recognizes herself for 5 minutes for an opening statement. Good morning, and thank you all for attending today's hearing on legislation to make cars safer. We continue in the subcommittee on our mission to save lives. The number of vehicle-related fatalities has been staggering over the last several years. In both 2017 and 2018, vehicle-related deaths have exceeded 40,000. This troubling development meant that Congress must act. And today, we are here to look at bills to address contributing factors to this spike in auto-related deaths. One of these factors is impaired driving. I thank my colleague, Debbie Dingell, for her leadership on this issue, and I thank Ranking Member McMorris Rodgers and Representatives Bucshon and McNerney for their initiative to address impaired driving. Another factor is uneven or slow deployment of technology. Since 1990, over 800 children have died from heat stroke in vehicles. In the vast majority of those cases, the adult did not realize the child was inside the car. Most of the children dying are infants and toddlers. 87% are 3 years or younger, but adults as well as pets have fallen victim to heat stroke as well. 21 children have died already this year, 21. This is unacceptable. We can do better, and we must do better. This raises the question, how do we prevent heat stroke deaths? It's not enough to educate parents about the risks. Even the best parents can get distracted. We need safety features built into our vehicles. You get a warning when you leave your car keys in the ignition. You should get the warning when a child is left in the back seat. And that's what the Hot Cars Act does. The bill, which was introduced with Representatives Tim Ryan and Peter King, would require new vehicles to be equipped with sensor technology to detect the presence of a child in the vehicle and notify the driver or parent. This safety technology has already been developed, and it's available in some vehicles today. Our Hot Cars Act will ensure that this life-saving technology is equipped on all vehicles. But our auto safety work does not end there. The New York Times has identified at least 28 deaths and 45 injuries since 2006 attributed to carbon monoxide poisoning caused by keyless ignition vehicles that were inadvertently left running. Since keyless ignition systems do not require drivers to turn off a vehicle to remove their key from the ignition, drivers can leave their vehicle, and that's what happens, key, fob in hand, not realizing that the vehicles are still running. A vehicle left running in an attached garage can and has quickly filled the living space with lethal levels of carbon monoxide. We'll hear more about that today. The rise in keyless ignition has also exacerbated the problem of automobile rollaways. Unlike traditional ignition systems, a keyless ignition system permits the driver to exit the vehicle, key in hand, without the car being in park. Fortunately, some auto manufacturers, including GM and Ford, have responded to these hazards by implementing additional safety features, including auto shutoff systems to prevent carbon monoxide poisoning and safeguards that prevent a vehicle from shutting down unless the vehicle is in park. Still, few automakers seem willing to address these new risks and passengers, to drivers and passengers and pedestrians and property from keyless ignition technology. And that's why, let me checking the time here, whoops. And that's why I introduced the Parkett Act with my colleagues, Darren Soto, Joe Kennedy, and Seth Moulton. So I thank the witnesses for being here. I especially Ms. Livingston for being here because she has experienced the tragedy of her parents dying. We'll hear from her today. It takes a lot of courage to be here. So now I yield back and I recognize Ms. Rogers, ranking member of the Subcommittee on Consumer Protection and Commerce, for 5 minutes for her opening statement.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and good morning to everyone, and welcome to the Consumer Protection and Commerce Subcommittee legislative hearing on improving motor vehicle safety. We lose more than 37,000 lives a year on our roads. We can and we must do more to make our roadways safer, especially considering most of these accidents were preventable. According to the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, 94% of all accidents are due to human error. These include distracted driving, driving drowsy, and driving while under the influence of alcohol or drugs. Drunk driving remains a significant public health concern that tragically cuts life short for too many. Not just for those who make the reckless decision to get behind the wheel after consuming alcohol, but also our family and friends on the road in the wrong place at the wrong time. Drug-impaired driving is also on the rise. If you feel different, you drive different. It's the new public safety message from NHTSA. It means exactly what it says. If you consume drugs, you will feel different. If you feel different, you will drive different. And if you drive different, you will put your life in danger and the lives of those on the road with you. Whether the drug is illegal or legally prescribed, driving while drug impaired is a serious safety threat. According to a recent report, in 2016, more than 1,000 fatally injured drivers, or almost 20% of the drug-positive drivers, tested positive for opioids in their system. The most frequent opioids abused were oxycodone, hydrocodone, morphine, fentanyl, and methadone. Opioids aren't the only drug making our roads less safe. So is marijuana. In fact, marijuana is the most common drug found in fatally injured drivers. In 2012, my home state of Washington legalized marijuana. According to a recent report conducted by the Northwest High Intensity Drug Trafficking Area, 1 in 5 10th graders, 1 in 4 12th graders reported riding with a driver who had been using marijuana. 1 in 6 12th graders admitted to driving a vehicle within 3 hours of consuming marijuana. And the percentage of marijuana-positive drivers has more than doubled, from 7.8% to 18.9%. And fatal crashes involving marijuana have spiked to almost 13%, up from 7.8% prior to legalization. Recreational use of marijuana poses a serious threat to roadway safety. We must learn from the lessons we've seen in Washington State and make sure that we are focusing on addressing drug-impaired driving and alcohol-impaired driving. That's why I, along with Mr. McNerney, have introduced legislation to direct NHTSA to study impaired driving to learn more about the risk drug impairment poses. Our solution gives NHTSA the flexibility it needs to examine the drug-impaired driving in the most efficient and effective way possible. It allows NHTSA to review methods to detect drug-impaired driving. It supports NHTSA's research to review methods to detect drug-impaired driving and develop impairment standards for driving under the influence. Our bill will lead to a better understanding of the risk and the ways to prevent drug-impaired driving. It will allow NHTSA to produce extremely important data that will inform decision-making on policies that can save lives. We're also considering legislation introduced by my colleagues, Mr. Bouchon and Ms. Dingell, that will authorize money that's been appropriated for the last 2 fiscal years. Returning to regular order and ensuring funds are accounted for by this committee is critical. Remember, if you feel different, you drive different. I'd also like to acknowledge that this is the last day for Melissa, who's been the head staffer for the Republicans on the Consumer Protection and Commerce Subcommittee. And I just want to say thanks for her exceptional leadership. She has a tremendous depth of knowledge, her strategic thinking, her hard work, all to get results on behalf of the many important issues before this district. And although we're going to miss her, I just wanted to take this opportunity to recognize her and wish her all the best in this next chapter. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, and let me also wish Melissa the best of luck and thank her for the service that she's been to our committee. And now I would recognize Mr. Pallone, the chairman of the full committee, for 5 minutes for his opening statement.
Thank you, Chairwoman Schakowsky, and thanks for all you do on these safety issues. I know we reported out of the full committee last week a number of initiatives from this subcommittee that you were responsible for, that, you know, to help children. And, you know, this continues with your constant efforts to help consumers, you know, in so many different ways. Since 2014, the number of auto fatalities has steeply increased after nearly a decade of falling. And despite the rising death toll, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, or NHTSA, has failed to prioritize vehicle safety. NHTSA has failed to complete needed rulemakings or prioritize resources to address preventable injuries and fatalities. Where the administration has been slow to act, Congress must step in. The bills we're considering today will help address preventable tragedies, including child vehicular heat stroke, carbon monoxide poisoning, and impaired driving. As we learned in May when this subcommittee held a hearing on summer driving dangers, 823 children have died from heat stroke after being left in hot cars over the last 20 years. And since that hearing, 12 more children have died, and that's 21 children so far this year. No child should lose their life because they became trapped in a hot car. Fortunately, technologies exist today that can end these senseless tragedies, technologies that can alert drivers to the presence of a child in the vehicle or remind a driver to check their back seat before leaving the car. Regrettably, these sorts of life-saving technologies have not yet been widely deployed. And I commend the chairwoman and Representatives Ryan and King for their work on the Hot Cars Act. This legislation would require vehicles to be equipped with safety technologies to detect and alert the driver to the presence of a child or occupant in the rear seat of a vehicle after the engine is shut off. And I look forward to exploring how this technological revolution can save lives. I also look forward to exploring how we can ensure that technological innovations like keyless ignition systems do not actually present unintended safety issues. Keyless ignition systems provide an added level of convenience for the driver. Merely sit in the vehicle and push to start, all with your keys in your pocket or bag. But that added convenience has been tied to a troubling rise in carbon monoxide deaths, more than 36 since 2006. Without the physical motion of turning a key, some drivers inadvertently forget to turn off the vehicle. I'll include myself among those. And some keyless ignition systems permit the engine to continue idling even when the driver exits the vehicle with the keys. If the vehicle is left in an enclosed area, tragedy can ensue as dangerous levels of carbon monoxide build. Such a tragedy claimed the lives of Dr. James Livingston and Dr. Sherry Penny. I thank Ms. Livingston for testifying today and sharing her parents' story, and I again commend the chairwoman as well as Representatives Soto, Kennedy, Moulton, Deutsch, and Gonzalez for introducing the Park It Act. This legislation would ensure the engine of a keyless ignition vehicle automatically shuts off if left idling for an unreasonable amount of time. I also look forward to discussing two impaired driving bills. With 10,000 deaths, 30% of all fatal crashes tied to drunk driving and troubling increases in the rate of drug-impaired driving, we have to double down on our efforts to prevent such threats to auto safety. So I want to thank our witnesses, and I wanted to yield the remainder of my time to Representative Dingell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you and Chairman Schakowsky for holding this important hearing today. I want to start by talking about the single largest cause of traffic fatalities, drunk driving. This is a cause that matters to too many families. They've been hit and struck by it, the most recent in my own community, by the Abbas family in January. The Abbas family was driving back from a family vacation when their car was struck head-on by a drunk driver, and there were no survivors. Mother, father, 3 children. Needlessly killed because someone made the decision to drink and drive. July, this month, is the deadliest month for drunk driving. Across the country, families and loved ones are repeating what our community went through in January. It's time. Congress has to step up and do something. And do something we will. I'm so proud to co-lead Mr. Bouchon's bill that we are considering here today that would authorize funds for pilot programs, demonstration projects, and innovative solutions to address impaired driving. And I also will be introducing legislation of my own later this week. Yield back the balance of my time. Thank you.
And I yield back, Madam Chair.
The gentleman yields back, and the chair now recognizes Mr. Walden, ranking member of the full committee, for 5 minutes for his opening statement.
Good morning, Madam Chair, and thanks for having this hearing. Each year, tragically, we lose 37,000 people on our roads, in no small part due to impaired driving. In fact, since January of 2000, more than 200,000 people have died from impaired driving. Now, whether that's alcohol, marijuana, or opioids, the consumption of drugs is making our roads less safe and more deadly. Alcohol-impaired driving remains a serious problem and one that cuts far too many lives short, as we all know. But drug-impaired driving has also taken hold of our roadways, and to be clear, you cannot drive safely if you're impaired. While it is illegal to drive while under the influence of marijuana, opioids, or any potentially impairing drug, even if the drug has been legally prescribed, sometimes it's difficult to figure out. Driving while impaired by any substance, legal or illegal, puts drivers and those who share the road with them in great danger. The National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, NHTSA, is getting the word out about the dangers of driving after consuming drugs through the It's If You Feel Different, You Drive Different, and Drive High, Get a DUI campaigns, and we're appreciative of that. Today, we'll discuss two measures that will help advance NHTSA's efforts to combat impaired driving, introduced by Representatives Rogers and Dr. Bouchon. The first bill, the Combating Impaired Driving Act 2019, introduced by Dr. Bouchon and Ms. Dingell, authorized important funding to NHTSA to conduct research on impaired driving, including drug-impaired driving. The more NHTSA can focus on this issue, the more we can learn about its unique challenges and make better, more informed public policy decisions. Second piece of legislation, the Impaired Driving Study Act 2019, introduced by Mrs. Rogers and Mr. McNerney, directs NHTSA to study impaired driving so we can learn more about the devastating effects marijuana and opioid impaired driving are having on our roads. Coming from a state that's legalized marijuana, this is an increasingly important issue to overcome. The bill is intended to give NHTSA the flexibility it needs to determine how best to study this issue, and requires NHTSA to report to us on the progress of the study as well as any findings. And under the bill, NHTSA can review different methods to detect drug-impaired driving, work with state and local partners on state-based drug-impaired driving policies, and learn the role and extent of drug impairment in motor vehicle accidents and any other NHTSA issues NHTSA believes necessary to examine to combat drug-impaired driving in effective and efficient ways. So I appreciate the work on that and on, obviously, the Hot Cars Act as well. And with that, I want to make sure and provide plenty of time for Dr. Bouchon to discuss his legislation. With that, Madam Chair, I'd yield to him.
Thank you, and thank you to Chairwoman Schakowsky and Ranking Member Morris Rogers for holding this hearing today. Impaired driving is an epidemic across our nation that claims far too many lives each year. Although we continue to make headway in addressing drunk driving, drug-impaired driving is on the rise. In 2018, 38% of drivers killed in Indiana tested positive for alcohol, while 45% tested positive for one or more drugs. It is important that we take steps to promote technological advancements that help our law enforcement professionals on the ground to detect and prevent impaired driving. For that reason, I introduced, along with Congresswoman Dingell, H.R. 3890, the Combating Impaired Driving Act of 2019. This bill authorizes the Department of Transportation to provide funding to support grants and pilot programs that create innovative solutions to address impaired driving, including alcohol, opioid, and marijuana impaired driving. I'm glad to see the committee discuss this legislation today, and I look forward to hearing from our witnesses on how we can eliminate impaired driving and save lives. And I yield back to Mr. Walden.
And I yield back.
The chair would like to remind members of the committee that pursuant to committee rules, members will, written statements will be made part of the record. And I'd now like to introduce our witnesses for today's hearing. We have Ms. Susan Livingston, daughter of Dr. James D. Livingston and Dr. Sherry H. Perry. And I just want to give, again, a special thank you to you In our efforts to save lives in this committee and to change laws, we've seen the courage of family members who have suffered such devastating tragedies come forward. Appreciate that so much. We have Dr. Benjamin Nordstrom, Executive Director of Responsibility.org, and Ms. Kathy Chase, President, Advocates for Highway and Auto Safety. We want to, again, thank all the witnesses for joining us today. We look forward to hearing your testimony. At this time, the chair will recognize each witness for 5 minutes to provide their opening statement. Before I begin, I want to explain the lighting system for those who may not know it. In front of you is a series of lights. The light will initially be green at the start of your opening statement. The light will turn yellow when you have 1 minute remaining, so please begin to wrap up your testimony at that point. The light will turn off when, the light will turn red when your time expires. So, Ms. Livingston, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Good morning, Chair Schakowsky and Ranking Member Rogers, honored members of the subcommittee. My name is Susan Clark Livingston. I'm the first female partner of Brown Brothers Harriman, the private banking firm in Boston. I'm on the executive committee and board of governors of the Investment Company Institute in Washington and honorary consul general to Luxembourg for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. But today, I'm here as a daughter and as a mother. I appreciate the opportunity to speak to you about the tragic simultaneous deaths of my parents, Dr. James Duane Livingston and Dr. Sherry Penny Livingston. They died together the evening of this past May 7. Their bodies were found the early morning of May 10. I will never forget my sister Barbara's phone call to me that morning saying, "Dad and Sherry passed away last night, both of them from carbon monoxide." There are no words for this kind of family tragedy, and yet I want the story told. I'm here today to tell you that these deaths were preventable. They died of indifference. These deaths were caused by an automobile design flaw that can be fixed at low cost with readily available technology. It's a design flaw the car industry and the NHTSA have known about since keyless ignitions were introduced in 2006, 13 years ago. The truth is, the car manufacturers have failed to install this simple fix voluntarily. The NHTSA has failed to institute regulations that were proposed back in 2011 to prevent these deaths, so we beg you to act so that no other family has to go through what ours has experienced. As a family, we're still in shock, and we speak of these amazing individuals in the past tense. It still feels very strange. They're not yet in the ground. They will be buried next week on Tuesday, July 30th at St. James Church in Hyde Park, New York, the church of our ancestors and that of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, buried together beside my grandparents and great-grandparents. We're still in mourning, yet the more I learned about the failure of these car manufacturers constantly touting the safety of their vehicles to properly protect consumers, the more I want to be here today, which I know is a busy day in Washington, but to ask for your help to get this done. Jim and Sherry had a love affair like no other. Married 34 years, they were inseparable. Dad called Sherry his bride, and their love and respect for each other were unmatched. The news reports on their deaths referred to them as elderly, but the word hardly describes the physical and mental energy of these two intellects. Daily aerobics, tennis, swimming, attendance at every Harvard Club event, both in Sarasota and Boston, seasons tickets to the theater. They were indeed in their 80s. But these seniors had so much life and love left in them. We loved them. We miss them every day. Dad got his PhD from Harvard in physics at the very young age of 23, a brilliant scientist, 25-year research career at GE in Schenectady. He had 7 patents to his name on alloys that are still used in the space program today. He followed Sherry's career to Boston, being a feminist, and he was a professor of physics at MIT for 22 years. Top-rated professor year after year for freshman physics. I liked having him help me with my homework. He was an author, an avid tennis player, and he wrote a space column for the Patriot Ledger. He was a pretty cool guy. He was a proud father of 3 daughters and his only granddaughter, Julia Pell Livingston, age 17, who's here with me today. Sherry, my stepmom, was a driving force of nature. At 4'10", she punched above her weight, provost at Yale, first woman chancellor of the entire system of University of Massachusetts, and chancellor of UMass Boston with 20,000 students for over 12 years. She ran the Center for Collaborative Leadership there until last year. There's an endowed chair there in her name. She was my mentor, my role model. She was on the board of Boston Edison, now Eversource, the JFK Library. The night she died, she gave a speech to the International Women's Forum in Sarasota entitled, "Women in the 21st Century, Stuck or Unstuck?" That was the last time she was seen alive. Dad retired from MIT just 3 years ago, but even after retirement, he had regular speaking engagements and continued to author books. He awaited Sherry's retirement from UMass last year. They look forward to retirement between Sarasota and Hingham, Mass, where they had just bought a new oceanfront condo. It was built last winter. It looked out over the shipyard in the harbor. Their bodies were found Friday. They were moving into the condo the following Tuesday. Sadly, they never saw it. They were looking forward to these final years together on the verge of a new adventure after each working close to 50 years, contributing as teachers and wonderful contributors to society. They're no longer here to tell us what happened, and people ask what happened, but the scenario might go something like this. It could happen to anyone. It happened to two energetic and lively PhDs. After Sherry's speech, they drove back to their condo. They opened the automatic door to the two-car garage and drove in. Neither of these two were hard of hearing. Sherry reminded Jim, "It's trash night," and he went over to roll out the garbage can and the recycling bin. I know just where those barrels were in the garage. Sherry was still in the car. Perhaps the radio's still on. You know, the radio can run 4 minutes after a car stops. She went to the back seat, took out the briefcase and her speech, which we found later in the table in the condo. She entered the ground floor condo through the door in the garage and closed the garage door. After putting the barrels at the end of the drive, Dad entered the condo through the front door just next to the garage. The police found the key fob in Sherry's purse when they recovered the bodies. These engines are quiet. The key fob can be miles away from a car once that engine starts running. Some of you know. This was a flawed vehicle, a murder weapon. It was missing a basic safety feature. The neighbor noticed the barrels. Sorry.
Get a wrap up. Go
Okay,
ahead.
then
Just
no problem.
Finish real fast.
The neighbor noticed the barrels still left outside at the curb. And just like Chairman Pallone, I myself have also left my car idling. Carbon monoxide overwhelms a victim, causes piercing headaches, disorientation, and nausea. It is not a great way to die. They found my dad's body, his head in a pool of blood. The cleaning woman called 911. They determined a hazmat team needed to evacuate the carbon dioxide.
I'm gonna have to cut off your
Let me
testimony.
finish. We beg of you to please prevent another family from going through this. I know we cannot bring Dad and Sherry back. Our family sky is dark after losing these two bright stars, and how many more need to die? Can this measure please be passed? Thank you.
Thank you. I think it sounds like not only did your family lose did you lose precious parents, but they were great contributors. And our condolences, I'm sure I speak for the whole subcommittee, are certainly with you. And that's why we're dealing with this today. And now let me call on Dr. Nordstrom. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Chairwoman
Is
Schakowsky.
your mic on?
The green light says it's on. Maybe it's not close enough. Is that okay? Well, good morning, Chairwoman Schakowsky, Ranking Member Rogers, and all of the distinguished members of the subcommittee. I really want to thank you for the opportunity to testify today in support of the Impaired Driving Study Act of 2019 and the Combating Impaired Driving Act of 2019. So my name is Dr. Benjamin Nordstrom. I am the executive director at responsibility.org. And we're a national nonprofit that's funded by leading distilled spirits companies to eliminate drunk driving and underage drinking. My background is that I'm a board-certified addiction psychiatrist, I'm a criminologist, and I also serve as a physician with the U.S. Army Reserve. I want to applaud this committee for its long-time leadership on the whole host of auto and traffic safety issues, such as the topics being discussed today. And I really want to thank you for keeping focus on impaired driving over the years. And that's the topic that I've been asked to speak about. Now, my written testimony contains a lot of specific details. And in my oral comments, what I'd like to do is focus on 3 foundational points and then some policy recommendations. The first point I want to make is that while drunk driving deaths have fallen by 50% since 1982, and by about 30% since 1991, they've really plateaued over the past 10 years. And they still account for about a third of traffic deaths, and that's around 11,000 deaths a year, each and every one of which is completely preventable. And I think, as Ms. Livingston's moving testimony points out, it's not just losing a life, it leaves a hole in families, it leaves a hole in communities, and they're all vitally important. The second point I want to make is that drug driving has been increasing at an alarming rate over the past decade. Now, it's really hard to give you a specific number about how much it has because the data that we have around this are fairly limited, but the information we do have is alarming. Now, there are no national standards for obtaining toxicological data after motor vehicle crashes or impaired driving cases. And we know that obtaining these toxicological samples and running tests on them is very expensive. And as a result, a lot of municipalities don't look after they ascertain that there's a presence of an illegal blood alcohol concentration. So we think that we're undercounting these things perhaps significantly. My third foundational point is that increasingly people are driving after having used more than one substance. We know this from toxicological evidence from people who have died in crashes. And the reason why this behavior is so lethal is that combining drugs can lead to additive, if not multiplicative effects on impairment. So continued investment in research initiatives to better understand the scope of this problem, as well as to better understand how drugs impair driving, is really essential to guide not just resource allocation, but also to identify effective drug driving countermeasures. And we fully support the proposed legislation to authorize NHTSA to study this issue further. Drug-impaired driving is different and more complex than alcohol-impaired driving. And so a lot of the strategies that have been used in alcohol-impaired driving can be applied to this. There's going to be some specific policy approaches that need to be used specifically for this. So a comprehensive approach that includes public education, policy, and enforcement initiatives is outlined in my written testimony, but we fully support the impaired driving legislation introduced this week to authorize NHTSA funding for grants and pilot programs into drug-impaired driving prevention efforts. So in addition, the other things that are worth considering include supporting the creation of a national minimum standard for toxicological investigations in motor vehicle crashes and drug-impaired driving cases, allocating additional highway safety funds to improve state labs, monitoring NHTSA's progress in creating large-scale education efforts, and then allocating funds appropriately to expand the efforts that are deemed effective, using screening and assessment in all cases of impaired driving so individual risk and treatment needs can be identified, researching the effects of drug on driver impairment, and expanding the implementation of accountability and DWI courts for high-risk offenders, and lastly, requiring the use of interlocks for all DUI offenders. In conclusion, this is going to take a comprehensive approach that's going to require that we break down some of the silos that typically exist between the state and the federal levels, and building broader coalitions than we've ever had before so that we can reduce recidivism and save lives. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And now let me ask Ms. Chase to take 5 minutes and give her statement.
Good morning, Chairwoman Chakowski, Ranking Member McMorris Rogers, and members of the subcommittee. I'm Kathy Chase, President of Advocates for Highway and Auto Safety. Celebrating our 30th anniversary this year, Advocates is a unique and successful coalition of insurers, consumers, public health and safety groups dedicated to preventing motor vehicle crashes, which are responsible for approximately 100 deaths and 7,500 injuries each day on average. Thank you for convening this important hearing to address issues that will protect and keep families whole. Steps can and must be taken to protect children from tragic heat stroke incidents in cars, to curb the dangers associated with keyless ignition systems, and to reduce impaired driving. We are here today because people are not infallible. We are, however, inventive. There are current proven solutions to these issues. Tragically, the problem of hot cars has taken the lives of at least 21 children this year, including 12 children during the short time since this subcommittee held a hearing on this issue in May. Moreover, we're in the dog days of summer, and most of the country just experienced a major heat wave, punctuating the need for swift action. Neuroscience experts have explained that common circumstances, such as stress, fatigue, or change in routine, can all lead to this serious and deadly outcome. Technology is available now that can detect the presence of a child in a vehicle and alert drivers and caregivers. The ability of the system to detect is a critical component, especially since on average, over 25% of vehicular heat stroke deaths happen as a result of the child getting into the car on their own. I'd like to now show a brief video to highlight this feature from just a couple companies. I've been told that the audio might not work, but I still think it's important that you see that the technology is in existence. So here the detection system is in the roof. You can't see it. And the alarm system was going off. If you could hear this, it's quite loud, and there are multiple components. There's an audio, a visual, and also an app. In this instance, the child is getting into the car, unbeknownst to the parents. The dad gets out. There's the visual. And now what you can't hear is a very loud honking noise because the car detected that the child was hiding in the car. As you can see from the clips, lives can be saved now using technology on the market today, which according to suppliers costs approximately $20 to $40. And the cost will go down even further once it becomes standard equipment, as we've experienced with other safety technologies like rear-view cameras and airbags. We commend Chairwoman Schakowsky, along with Representatives Tim Ryan and Peter King, for introducing the Hot Cars Act and call on Congress to swiftly enact it. Secondly, the invention of keyless ignition systems, also known as push-button starts, has resulted in unintended deadly consequences. This feature is now standard in nearly 2/3 of vehicles sold, up from just over 10% in 2008. Without needing to turn and remove a key to disengage the vehicle, drivers can park their car in the garage, exit the car, and go inside their home with their key in hand or handbag, all the while thinking they have turned the car off. This scenario can lead to a fatal level of carbon monoxide being emitted from the parked running car. Stories like this continue to devastate families across the country, including Susan, who bravely recounted the recent deaths of her parents. The Park It Act will require new cars with keyless ignitions to have an automatic shutoff before carbon monoxide can accumulate to a dangerous level. Additionally, the legislation would help prevent vehicle rollaways, which happen when a driver exits the car while it's still in gear. These incidents can lead to a driver being struck by their own vehicle, or the car continuing unabated, potentially striking objects or people in its path. We applaud the leadership of the chairwoman and other co-sponsors in introducing the Park It Act and urge Congress to enact it. Thirdly, impaired driving continues to kill more than 10,000 people every year. My written testimony includes a number of actions Congress should take, including getting passive sensor technology, such as DADs, into cars, incentivizing states to lower their BAC laws and enact all offender ignition interlock laws, and providing funds to accelerate research, training, and solutions to the growing problem of drug-impaired driving. In conclusion, these remedies address a few of the fallibilities of humans. Some claim that driverless cars will be the panacea, and we hope they're correct. However, when this subcommittee decides to consider driverless car legislation, we urge you to require safeguards, including minimum performance standards for technologies to protect those in AVs and everyone around them. Proven technologies, in addition to the ones being discussed today, such as automatic emergency braking, blind spot detection, and lane departure warning, should be in all new cars now. They will both pave the way toward AVs and save lives along the way. Advocates looks forward to continuing to work with this subcommittee to make cars, drivers, and roads in America safer. Thank you so much.
I thank the excellent testimony of all our witnesses. So we've concluded the opening statements, and now we will move to member questions. Each member will have 5 minutes to ask questions of our witnesses, and I will start by recognizing myself. So one death may be an anomaly, but over 3 dozen documented deaths prove that keyless ignition systems can be deadly and dangerous. And without appropriate safeguards in place, anyone with a keyless ignition vehicle could be in danger. So, Ms. Livingston, you yourself have accidentally left your keyless ignition vehicle running. I've done it as well. For 9 hours while you were at work, is that right? And so what I wanted to ask you, though, is if you could explain how easy it is for a distracted driver to inadvertently leave keys in the ignition and the car running.
Yes, so in my case, I've had it happen 3 times, and I dropped my car off at Wonderland T Station to go into Boston and park my car. Luckily, it's an outdoor garage, but my radio continued running. I listened to Bloomberg on the way to work, and the radio was going. I grabbed my bag. I stepped out. There's quite a bit of traffic, by the way, as well, so you can't hear the engine. I locked the car. There's absolutely no indication, went into work, and when I came back to the car, I got in and I looked at the dashboard and I thought, wait a minute, I think my car's running. And I just felt really lucky I didn't run out of gas. And I've heard so many stories now since it's happened to my parents of other people who came and their car had run out of gas. One time I did the old valet trick where I valeted the car and the United Way Women's Breakfast in Boston, and they took the car. I had the key fob in my purse. I went to the breakfast, and I came out to the valet and waited, and all these people were leaving. And I was like, I have another meeting. Where's my car? And they said, oh, you never gave us the key fob. So, again, this has happened, and I had a friend who, they rented a car, and he drove the car up, and his son took the rental car from here, from D.C. up to New York. And his son got to New York and realized his dad still had the key in his pocket. So these are things that happen that are inconvenient and annoying, but usually not fatal. And I would suggest this happens a lot. Now, when there are 2/3 of new vehicles or all have this keyless technology, we really do need better systems. And GM and Ford have embraced it.
36 deaths that we have documented. There may be
There are
more
many
that we
more,
don't
I'm
know
sure.
about exactly. Mistakes obviously should not cost lives. Ms. Livingston, should technologies that automatically shut off a keyless ignition vehicle if the engine has idled for dangerous period of time be required in all cars? And do you support the Park It Act?
Yes, I support the act. And I have noted that if the car had run just 30 minutes and turned off, my parents would still be alive. I rented a GM down in Sarasota when I was cleaning out the condo, which is not an easy job to do. And it was so hot, it was 103 degrees. So I understand people say, oh, I want to leave the AC on. I had to grab papers to go to the lawyer. And I walked out of the car and the horn honked. I mean, that was really great reminder that I had the key. I intentionally was just running into the condo and back. I think these things are so easy to install. I can't get my head around why the other car manufacturers have just ignored it.
Thank you. So I want to switch to a different topic right now. 21 children have tragically died this year. This is a record inside a hot car. A majority of these tragic deaths are accidents, distracted parents merely going about their busy lives, accidentally leaving their children inside a rapidly warming car. So, Ms. Chase, the technologies exist today that can detect the presence of a child left in a car. We saw your video. Why is it important, so important, to adopt technologies that can detect, I'm talking about detection systems now, the presence of a child, and why this is an element that is essential?
Thank you for the question. It is so important that there's a detection system. First of all, no parent or caregiver thinks that this will happen to them. Nobody wakes up in the morning and thinks they're either going to leave their child in the car unintentionally or that a child will climb into a car, but it's happening. And we have the technological solutions, especially, as you mentioned, Madam Chairwoman, the detection system, because that can say there's somebody in this car or a pet and action needs to be taken. If there's just an alarm, that can be accomplished with different technologies such as door sequencing, and it won't detect all of the children that are dying now. So we want the effective solution to take place, and hot cars will do that.
Thank you. Time flies. I yield back.
Yes.
And now recognize the ranking member of the subcommittee, Ms. Rogers.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Dr. Nordstrom, why is it important for NHTSA to study drug-impaired driving, including the opioid impairment? Are there holes in the data we have today that we could learn more about with a targeted study?
Indeed. Thank you for the question. First, there are holes in the data, I think, because that really speaks to one of the fundamental challenges that we have. When we think about the fatality analysis reporting system, which looks at the drugs that might be present in somebody after a fatal car crash, what we see is that the way that it's implemented is very different from state to state, and it's used in 2% of cases in some states, up to 96% in other states. So there's not any uniformity to it. And then furthermore, when the drugs are actually looked for, different cutoffs are used as well. And so we get uneven reporting, and so we're kind of constantly comparing apples to oranges. It makes it really hard to know the actual full extent of the problem. The reason why it is very important is because there are large educational holes that probably need to be filled. We know that when it comes to people's beliefs about using different medications or different recreational drugs, there's not any really clear sense from the population, the using community, about what is safe and what isn't safe. And so we have to understand the scope of the problem so then we can actually target finding out what kinds of countermeasures we need to do and then measure them to see if they're working. So we know how to allocate those resources in the future.
Good. What do you think is the most important aspect to be studying as far as the drug-related impaired driving?
So I think that there are a number of things that are really important. And I think that a big one is looking at the prevalence of things. And so looking at doing things like oral fluid analysis and expanding opportunities to do that, like it's being done in Michigan, I think would be very, very important so that we can understand what's happening on the roads. And then that also leads to, I think, the next thing that's really important, which is a very, very good assessment and screening for everybody who is found to be driving while impaired so that we can understand what their treatment needs are and what their supervision needs are so that we can individualize plans so that we know that we're targeting the underlying causes of a very lethal criminal behavior.
Great. Appreciate that. Would you share with the committee what polydrug use is and what risk it poses to the public? Is this an issue that NHTSA should focus on during the study in our bill? And if so, how would improving data on this issue help state and federal officials?
Thank you. Yes, so polydrug use is just the use of more than one psychoactive substance at the same time. So that could be alcohol and marijuana, which seems to be the most common combination that's being detected in the FARS data. But it could also be cocaine or methamphetamine and alcohol, or it could be opioids and marijuana. It could be lots of different things. And the reason why that's very important is, again, those substances are going to interact in the brain and create kind of unpredictable, at this point, effects on driving. We know that sometimes it's a 1 + 1 = 2, and so people have smoke a little bit and do some opioids, and sometimes it's actually multiplicative, and you'll get a 1 + 1 = like a 3 kind of effect out of it. And so this is the sorts of things that we need to understand better in terms of how these drugs affect people, and then we also have to be able to communicate that to the public so that they know what is safe.
One last question. Based on your experience with impaired driving, do you believe it is important to treat drug-impaired driving as seriously as driving under the influence of alcohol?
Well, I certainly think it's every bit as lethal. Now, we know that drunk driving is still far more prevalent behavior, but as people's drug use patterns change over time, we're going to see that, we're going to see those changes in our statistics as well, and it's every bit as lethal, so it deserves as much attention.
Okay, thank you very much. I yield back.
Thank you. I do want to acknowledge in the audience today we have Helen Whitty, who is the head of MAD, Mothers Against Drunk Driving, who for decades has been helping to make our roads safer. And now I recognize Chairman Pallone for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Consumers have an expectation that safety is ingrained in every component of their car, even features like keyless ignition systems. But I wanted to start out by asking Ms. Livingston, were you or your parents aware of the potential dangers posed by keyless ignition vehicles? And even if your parents were notified of the potential dangers, do you believe they're aware that awareness alone would have saved their lives, if I can ask?
No, they were not aware, as far as I know, nor was I. And in fact, Sherry purchased this particular car based on its safety features. So the keyless ignition has been marketed and sold as a convenience without any real notification of the potential dangers. I think education does help, but as Ms. Chase suggested, humans make mistakes, and I still think with a very inexpensive technology, we really could protect people and save lives.
Oh, thank you. I'm not even sure I understand how it's a convenience, but whatever. Thank you. Ford
Me
and
neither. It wasn't that hard to turn a key.
I
Do you
know.
agree? Okay.
I agree. Ford and General Motors have installed technologies automatically shutting off the engine of a keyless ignition vehicle if it has idled for an unsafe period of time, and Toyota has pledged to do the same with its 2020 model year vehicles. So I wanted to ask Ms. Chase, with industry beginning to adopt some of these safety features, why do you think it's still important to have a robust federal standard on the books? We always ask the question, do we need to do this?
We need to do this, and we need to do it because these are voluntary measures, and there's no requirement without a federal mandate that this technology that has been proven to save lives be in all cars. It's also not happening quickly enough. With every passing day, we're endangering people throughout this country unnecessarily when there's proven technology that can be saving lives.
Thank you. And vehicle rollaways are another hidden danger tied to keyless ignition systems. With a traditional ignition system, a driver is unable to physically remove the key from the ignition until the vehicle is in park. But with keyless ignition systems, drivers are reporting that they can shut off and leave the vehicle with the car still in gear. So let me, again, Ms. Chase, what safeguards can be deployed to prevent these sorts of issues with the...
And I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman, are you talking about the rollaway issue?
Yeah, the rollaway.
So the Park It Act would solve this problem. There are 5 conditions that if a car isn't in park, if the door is open, if the driver is out, then the car will be stopped. And this is essential legislation that should be passed expeditiously. And that's a really hard thing to say. But we really thank you for your leadership. And when we know that people are dying, when there's a solution at hand, it's all the more tragic. So let's get this technology into cars. We urge Congress to take immediate action on the Park It Act, as well as the Hot Cars Act, to stop these preventable fatalities.
Again, thank you, because I think we really should spare no expense to protect our nation's kids. Ms. Chase, again, how expensive is the technology used to detect the presence of a child in a vehicle and alert the driver or parent?
I've spoken with a few of the suppliers, and I've heard that it can range from $20 to $40, but the key of that is once they're required as standard equipment, we all know that the price significantly goes down. So that's why this legislation is so essential, to get it as standard equipment into all cars.
Now, we know that during our May hearing, Mr. Harrison shared the heartbreaking story of the death of his son Chase, who tragically died after being accidentally left in a hot car. So let me go back to Ms. Chase. Do you believe that Mr. Harrison or any of the hundreds of other parents who have lost a child to vehicular heat stroke would have been willing to pay for these technologies?
Absolutely. Miles's story is heart-wrenching. We worked very closely with him and KidsInCars.org and all of the incredibly brave families who come up to Congress, who have been coming for years, and talk about the worst thing that has ever happened to them and their families over and over again. It is time for this technology to be put in all cars now.
Just let me ask one more question. Do you believe that child detection technologies are sophisticated enough to accurately and reliably detect the presence of a child in the vehicle?
I do believe that, and in fact, we're working on holding another demonstration so that all members of Congress and members of the public can come see how this technology works. We had one a couple months ago, and we're going to keep showing this technology, which gets better and better over time. But we believe that it is there now, and we also know that the rulemaking process takes some time. So then that period of time, technology will continue to evolve. When we're talking in the same breath about driverless cars, certainly we can get a detection system into cars.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
I now recognize Mr. Latta for 5 minutes for his questions.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you very much for our witnesses for being with us in today's hearing. Dr. Nordstrom, in your testimony, you spoke about the need to implement a comprehensive approach that includes innovative solutions to eliminate impaired driving. Two of the bills that we are discussing today aim to improve motor vehicle safety and prevent impaired driving. In addition to these proposals, I believe we should also be examining and encouraging the deployment of self-driving technologies, which have the potential to save tens of thousands of lives that are lost every year to impaired driving. Over 10,000 people lost their lives in 2017 in alcohol-impaired driving crashes. We have also seen a significant increase in the number of Americans drivers killed in vehicle crashes in which drugs were detected. According to the Governor's Highway Safety Association in 2016, the number of drivers who were fatally injured in accidents with drugs in their system surpassed the number of those with alcohol in their system for the first time ever. 94% of the accidents are attributed to human error, including through impaired driving. These statistics are staggering and show that we must work together to prevent more tragedies, and that's why last Congress I introduced the Self-Drive Act, which would have clarified the federal and state roles in regulating self-driving vehicles, ensured consumer safety, reduced traffic-related fatalities and injuries, and improved mobility for individuals with disabilities. This legislation also included legislation from a previous version of our Chair Schakowsky's legislation to prevent the tragedies we heard about today when a child is left in a hot car. The Self-Drive Act passed unanimously out of this committee and on the floor, and I hope that we and our Democrat colleagues will continue to work with me to make this a priority. Again, self-driving cars are our future, and without congressional action, the U.S. will be at a competitive disadvantage, and Americans will lose out in safe life savings benefits. We have this opportunity to work towards ending senseless deaths on our roads by making investments in our vehicle technologies. So, Dr. Nordstrom, have you considered the self-driving vehicles as a component of the comprehensive approach to addressing impaired driving?
So thank you for the question. I think you're absolutely right. I think that there is a lot that will be gained when we get there. And I think that it's, that could be a massive boon for saving thousands of lives on American roadways. The challenge is it's going to take a while to get there. And so in the meantime, I'm very heartened to see the time and attention this committee is putting in to all of the incremental steps between now and when we finally get to where you're describing, so that we can save as many lives as possible in the interim.
Okay, so I just want to make sure, so in your studies right now, you haven't been taking in the thought of driverless technologies, or you have been considering it as you're doing the research?
Well, I think that, we see that as something that is pretty far in the future for us, and especially when you think about the way that the fleet's going to turn over for when we think about this and how we're going to sort of allocate our efforts, we're concerned about the nearer term. So even though I completely agree with you that that's ultimately something that I think is going to be perhaps even sort of solving the problem definitively, until we get there, we have to be doing these other things.
Okay, if I could just follow up with another question. You focused on the increasing dangers of drivers being impaired by opioids across the country, and especially in my home state of Ohio. The opioid and drug addiction crisis has devastated our communities. And you point out that the government, especially the FDA, can do more to increase awareness of the safety risks of driving while impaired by opioids. What are some of the ways the FDA can do this, and how can the federal government in general help to improve the understanding of opioid-impaired driving?
So it's a great question, and I think that ultimately one of the things that we really need to do is have much better efforts at educating physicians on how to talk to patients about risk when they're prescribing, and also to talk with pharmacists about how to talk about risks when they're dispensing to people. I can tell you from having been in clinical practice for years, the number of patients who would express surprise when I would tell them, do not drive after you start taking this medication until you know exactly how it affects you, and it's going to take several days for you to know that. They would say, well, nobody's ever told me that before. And it's the kind of thing that we really need to be pushing so that people understand what these risks are, because I think that there's a lot of this that people just kind of assume if their doctor or pharmacist isn't saying something, or if they're just putting a little sticker on the bottle, it must not be that serious, and it really is. So I think we need to be doing more in terms of educating.
Well, thank you very much, Madam Chair. My time has expired, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. I now recognize Congresswoman Dingle for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Madam Chair. As I mentioned, this week I will be introducing a bill that calls for commercializing and standardizing a passive alcohol detection system. This technology needs to be the standard in all new vehicles. And it will save 7,000 to 10,000 lives every year. It also calls for a significant field test and a reasonable rulemaking process leading towards making driver impairment technology a federal standard. I hope my colleagues can join me in supporting this measure, and I ask their chairwoman if she'd consider another hearing in September when the legislation's introduced.
Yes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm a car girl. Everybody knows that. And I believe the U.S. auto industry is home to some of the best and the brightest engineers in the world. They've solved complex problems, and they're working on new and amazing safety features all the time. So, and we all agree that we need to see some of them put on the vehicles themselves. You know, Frank asked, do we need regulation? Well, unfortunately, sometimes we do. And here's an example of when we do. It's just when it comes to advancing technology in vehicles that will prevent those who drink and drive, like the driver alcohol detection system for safety, we got to get it done faster. Because if the technology was in use today, the Obvious Stop Drunk Driving Act and legislation wouldn't be necessary. So I want to first ask a couple of questions on DADSS, because we've been hearing about this program for so long, before I ever got to Congress, to tell you the truth. And while we know there's room for improvement, we really need to get this technology tested at scale in front of consumers so we can start saving lives. Dr. Nordstrom, these questions are for you. Do you have an estimate on how many vehicles the DADSS program currently is being tested on?
I don't know right off the top.
Can you get that for the record, please? And in your opinion, what's needed to finally move? It's not a lot, though, is it?
No,
It's like
no, ma'am.
a minimal. But could you, just so that I know what it is, but can you give other people a sense about of how many vehicles it's really being tested on?
I think it's just a handful, ma'am.
Right, thank you. And in your opinion, what's needed to finally move this technology from the lab and that limited field testing to something that can be placed in vehicles and fleet tested on a larger scale?
Well, from my understanding, it's additional money in order to get the technology to finish the development of it and to start putting it into vehicles.
It's only money?
Well, money and time.
Do you think this technology, I shouldn't say only money, money does matter. Do you think this technology would be ready for a fleet test of 1,500 cars by 2020?
I'm sorry. Yes, I'm being told by the end of 2020 we could expect that.
Okay. I want to change my focus and ask a few questions about mandatory first offender interlocks. In states that have mandatory first offender interlock laws, have you seen a reduced number of alcohol-related fatalities?
Yes, ma'am.
Do you have a sense for the cause of the resistance from states that haven't implemented that mandatory first offender law?
From my conversations with people, you know, the things that we kind of hear about are that there's very frequently difficulties, especially in states that are fairly rural, that getting people to places where they can get those interlocks installed is difficult. And then the other thing that we frequently hear is difficulty getting them put in for indigent people.
Okay, and one last one, Dr. Nordstrom. If a police officer is out on patrol and sees someone swerving all over the road, they hopefully will pull that person over because from the outside, the car impaired driving tends to look the same. It could be a sleepy driver, that could be drunk, high. I share my colleagues' concerns about marijuana, texting, distractor, and combination of these. Do you think that law enforcement is generally in need of more resources for enforcement of impaired driving?
Yes, ma'am. I definitely do.
Thank you. Madam Chair, thanks for holding this hearing again, and I hope we're going to stay very focused on this issue. And I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back, and Mr. Guthrie, I think, is next. Am I right? Yes. Mr. Guthrie, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate the opportunity, and thanks for having this hearing. Thanks for being here, sharing your story, and thanks for being here, sharing your expertise and your advocacy. One of my big concerns, and I'm really glad we're pursuing the technology that affected your family, Ms. Livingston, but also one of the concerns I've had is impaired driving, particularly as some states are making the decision to allow people to use marijuana. And I think that encourages young people to say it's okay. I mean, for some reason it is, and that's just my belief. And so the question I hear from law enforcement people, just the difference is that when you see impaired driving, the difference is you can do a blood test, sobriety test with alcohol that you really can't do with marijuana. And so as more people are doing it, because it's being, the word not encouraged, but saying it's okay, but the state saying it's okay to do, then more people are doing it. And so, so Dr. Nordstrom, just the differences between drunk driving and just impaired driving, one by alcohol, one by I'll just say marijuana. I know other people can have other, and how, I know there's a study underway for NHTSA to try to differentiate and how you can test for that in the field test. Could you explain what's going on and how we could explore further?
So the challenge with alcohol versus cannabis, so that alcohol is very, very well studied at this point. It follows a pretty clear dose response curve that when people drink a certain amount of standard drinks, their blood level will rise at a predictable amount. Alcohol metabolism follows something called zero order kinetics, which means that a very predictable amount is removed over time. And it's just a much more sort of knowable field. When it comes to cannabis and THC, which is the psychoactive component in cannabis, that dose response curve is much trickier to estimate. The thing that's also difficult is the amount of THC in any given product varies wildly. The route of administration changes, whereas all alcohol is basically swallowed. Sometimes people are smoking, sometimes people are swallowing and orally ingesting cannabis products. So it's very, very hard to know when the levels are going to rise, and then the metabolism's different. The other thing that's different is in alcohol, we know that a certain blood level corresponds to a certain level of impairment. We don't have that same clear predictability when it comes to blood levels.
Because you can still have THC in your system but not be impaired, right? Because it lingers in your system longer?
So, well, THC itself it's always going to be intoxicating. That is psychoactive. And one of the first metabolites and one of the first breakdown steps in THC is still active. Eventually you get to an inactive form, and that inactive form stays around much longer than the active forms do.
So you know that when the active and inactive, then active is what's intoxicating.
So that's what's
important.
For our purposes, that's what's important to measure for impairment.
Well, does a field test, field sobriety, because if a police officer suspects alcohol or smells or whatever, they can do a field test to see if they're impaired. Then they go to the more tests. If you're going to do something in court, I'm sure you have to go further than that. Does a field test, can you tell an impaired driver with marijuana or cannabis as you can with?
Well, to Congresswoman Dingell's point, when somebody's weaving around the road, I mean, that's the first indication. When they pull them over and they're acting impaired, but they don't smell alcohol, they do a portable breath test and it's negative, then this is where it gets tricky. If they're not a specifically trained drug recognition expert, they might not know necessarily what to look for.
So the walking heel to toe, touching your nose with your eyes, because that kind of stuff wouldn't be the same effect as alcohol.
Field sobriety tests and say, yes, this person's impaired, but not be able to detect alcohol. So they'll say, well, something's up. And that's where the oral fluid testing can be very useful for somebody who hasn't gone through all the rigorous training to become a drug recognition expert. They could at least test oral fluid and then say, okay, this person does have THC or its active metabolite present in their system. So then you can start building probable cause for building a more kind of comprehensive case that the person's driving under the influence of cannabis.
And I'm sure that's inconsistent across police jurisdictions about how that's applied or not applied, or?
Yes, sir. Yes, there's not a standard approach. It's not that oral fluid testing has not really been built into standard operating procedure anywhere in the United States, as far as I know.
So there's no jurisdiction that does it now?
Not as part of SOP, sir.
Okay,
But it's been done in, I believe, Canada and Australia.
okay. So there are some places doing it
There's
we can
precedent.
study to see how it works and how it moves forward.
Yes, sir.
Well, thanks for that. I know it's very concerning, and thanks for all of you for being here today. I appreciate it very much. And I yield back.
Thank you, sir.
The gentleman yields back, and now I recognize Mr. Soto for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. You know, as technology increases in vehicles, we in Congress have to keep up with those changes. And while it is so exciting to have vehicles that are keyless and others that turn off and on for energy efficiency and others that will be plugged in, this committee's work is going to have to continue to make sure that we are doing the things we do to keep people safe. And we hear every week different issues that we have to work on, and I'm really proud to be part of a lot of these bills to help increase vehicle safety, particularly joining our chairwoman, Seth Moulton, and Congressman Kennedy, as well as Congressman Moulton, in dealing with issues in the Parkett Act of the risks of keyless ignition technology. I wanted to first start by asking Ms. Livingston, how important is this bill to protect our seniors, to protect our children and other vulnerable populations?
Thank you for the question. I think it's essential. I can't believe keyless ignition has been around for over 10 years and we don't have a regulation. The auto industry sometimes represents, oh, we'll do it on our own voluntarily. It has not happened. We need the legislation as soon as possible. 2 more people have died since my parents died in May, and it's not just elders. There was a young 20-year-old woman who died, and sadly her fiance survived. Sometimes it's worse to survive carbon monoxide, but we definitely need a law. NHTSA's looking for leadership from Congress on this.
Do you think most consumers are aware right now of the dangers of a car remaining on in a keyless ignition scenario?
I don't think so. I don't think my parents knew. I know I wasn't really aware of it, other than the fact that I had left my car a few times when it was still running and I couldn't hear it. And I think this, we saw a little confusion on terminology, but the auto stop to save gas, as you mentioned, a number of cars, when you get to a red light, the car engine stops. So people think that the engine is off. I think very few people are aware, and a number of people after the story came out on my parents mentioned to me they had never heard of it, and then more and more stories come out. We need to do something to protect consumers.
Thank you for that. And it's part of the initial theme, which is, you know, all these things are progressing, but it's the federal government's responsibility with these types of products that are in interstate commerce to make sure they're safe. People assume we're doing our jobs, and today, this is part of that. Ms. Chase, how important is the hot car technology? And similar questions, are people aware that this threat is out there, in your opinion?
The hot car technology is essential because with every passing day and it's hot outside, and by the way, this happens when it's not so hot out. It can happen when it's 60 degrees outside. Children are at risk, and we have a proven solution that there's a detection system and alarm system. There's no reason why this shouldn't be in all cars today.
And you think people are aware of this risk, particularly if it's 60 degrees out? Who would really think that that could be a risk?
You know, I think there is some awareness, but not enough. And nobody wakes up and thinks, oh, I might leave my child in the car today. And this happens especially when there's a change in routine where mom is usually the one who drops off the child at daycare, but mom's out of town on a business trip, so dad's doing it today. And say dad's driving to work. We all kind of go in autopilot in a sense. And you start thinking about something at work, or you get a call, which you shouldn't answer, but people do, and then you get distracted. And you forget there's a sleeping baby, rear facing, there's no indication really, there's no sound, there's no movement. There's technology there that can solve this problem. It's not the fault of the parent.
Well, and I'm glad you mentioned that because that's what I'd like to end on. The fact that we have this increasing technology to help with some of the new issues that other technology causes gives me hope that we're going to be able to resolve these issues and prevent the kind of tragedies that you all saw with your own eyes with your families. So thanks for being here today and thanks for your courage.
The gentleman yields back, and I now recognize Mr. Bouchon for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. I just had a hot car death in my district about a week and a half ago. 3 years old, was apparently asleep. So this is it's been devastating for the family, but also for the community of Evansville, Indiana, to realize that these things do happen, and the parent was a responsible parent. It just happens. So I'm glad the committee is working towards addressing that particular issue. I think it's important. You were talking, Dr. Nordstrom, about THC and impairment. As you know, opioid abuse is out there, but also just using opioids for legitimate purposes. And you mentioned, I think, in your testimony that because of that rise, that there's a huge opportunity for healthcare providers, and I was a physician before I was in Congress, healthcare practitioners to address opioid-impaired driving. Can you further expand on the opportunities available and how education plays a role and how physicians can help?
Absolutely, and thank you for the question, sir. You know, I'm sure as you remember from being in practice, very frequently you'll see people whose medications get added to. They're seeing a number of different specialists, and sometimes people aren't always thinking about medication interactions, especially when it comes to sort of cumulative effects on alertness.
Yeah.
So I think one thing that's very important is to be making sure that we're educating physicians about not just kind of the pharmacodynamic interaction, so how the drugs relate to each other chemically, but then the pharmacokinetic actions, but also the pharmacodynamic interactions. Which is
So it could be, I mean, there could be some impairment with medications that are not opioid or related, right? You could have a couple of medications that cause reactions that would result in impaired driving that are not traditionally thought of as causing impairment.
Absolutely, sir.
So that's where pharmacies come into play
and
too,
this
right?
is where, yeah, that there has to be sort of levels of intervention here, where if the physician forgets or doesn't have the conversation that the pharmacist does because somebody's on an antihistamine that's sedating, you know, that is going to potentially affect their ability to drive, same as a benzodiazepine, the same as an opioid. You know, and so I think that the physicians need to be thinking about this when they're doing informed consent with patients about medications. But the other part of it is that the doctors need to be thinking about when they're prescribing, making sure that they're reviewing the whole of the med list, and for the pharmacist to be doing the same thing.
Yeah, I've seen patients on 20 medicines before. It's pretty
Exactly.
routine. Honestly, it's pretty routine. A buddy who's a pharmacist will tell you that's the case. So do we have, and you were talking about just THC, but do we have laboratory tests for other than non-THC drugs like opioids, that can hold up in court as it relates to impairment?
Well, certainly we have.
I mean, unless you have a zero tolerance. I mean, if you have an opioid, and the law is it's zero.
In a zero tolerance, and there are per se standards for opioids in Nevada and Ohio, I believe, and I think those are the only two.
But broadly, we don't.
But broadly, we really don't, and a part of this is that there's not that same level of knowledge about what drug level in blood corresponds to.
But we do have pharmacokinetics. Probably to get FDA approval, you're going to have to show human pharmacokinetics for an opioid, right?
Sure, absolutely, sir.
So I mean, that may not necessarily have a direct correlation, though, with an impairment to a level which would make you dangerous.
Exactly, and I think that those.
So how do we get to that? That's why this money is important, right? How do we get to that?
So I think part of it is having those tests be done where they look at specifically driver impairment at different blood levels.
How did we do it with alcohol? Did we actually have drivers and have them I mean, initially, way
There
back.
are standardized lab sort of experiments where you can be in a driving lab with lane excursions and things like
That's
that.
what I'm saying. Then you have people
Absolutely,
drink alcohol.
Absolutely, the same
and measure their
methodology.
drug and test. So we haven't done that for opioids, really?
Well, I mean, I don't think,
Or other
not to the
drugs.
same extent that we have with alcohol, where the blood level would
Correlate.
definitively correlate and hold up in court in such a way that it would meet standards.
Yeah. Yeah, that's one of the things. And law enforcement are in a tough spot
Absolutely, and
because the field sobriety test may or may not hold up. And the reason I say that, I had a case in my district again where a 16-year-old girl was hit as a pedestrian and killed.
Oh my God.
And the driver in the field was obviously impaired, but the laboratory test showed no alcohol, no opioids, and was probably THC. But ultimately, they're still trying to, this is a couple years ago, they're still trying to prosecute that case. But there was a blood alcohol level of 0, no opioids, no benzos, but clearly failed field sobriety test, probably on marijuana.
Oh my Lord.
And they have not been able to adjudicate that case because there's no standard. So anyway, that does happen. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back, and I recognize Mr. McNerney for 5 minutes for his questions.
Well, I thank the chair, and I thank the witnesses this morning, very illuminating testimony. And I want to thank the ranking member for inviting me to co-lead the Impaired Driving Study Act. I've thought a lot about this issue, actually, and I want to sort of follow up on Mr. Bouchon. Mr. Nordstrom, can you envision a field impairment test that tests manual dexterity that could hold up in court?
Yes, sir. I mean, I think that with the standard field sobriety test, we can get to a point where the officer, especially if it's a drug recognition officer, can really correlate then what they're seeing in terms of a performance decrement to a specific drug or a class of drugs. So I think we could get there.
Okay, and it would hold up in court.
Ideally, sir, yes.
Okay, thank you. How would NHTSA conducting such a study as proposed in our legislation help us reduce the number of casualties resulting from alcohol impaired and other impaired driving?
Well, I think, sir, that if we have the opportunity to get people on their first offense and we can really identify what is going on, what they've been using, and then come up with specific targeted plans for how to intervene to address the underlying causes of the behavior, then it could potentially correct the problem later on so that there aren't multiple reoffenses.
I mean, it's my impression that reoffenses are really the dangerous incidents.
That's what the highest sort of risk are those people that have very high blood alcohol levels, above 0.15. The multiple reoffenders and the poly users, those people account for about 70% of the UI deaths. Yeah. So that those really high-risk people are the ones that we need to be focusing on.
Well, thanks. What are some of the things that would be helpful for NHTSA to examine in conducting the study?
So I think that there are a number of things, but I think really being able to get to the point where we can meet the sort of standards, like the Daubert standards for expert testimony, and so that's going to take a significant amount of kind of work to be able to correlate what we're seeing in terms of performance decrements, so that when an expert goes into court and says that they've noticed that this is the what they observed, that it can hold up to rigorous cross-examination, so that we can that the jury can have confidence that there actually was a deficit there.
So there's really opportunity for improvement in impaired driving.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Ms. Chase, I'm going to talk a little bit about cyber security issues with regard to auto safety. Today's cars really are computers on wheels, and they can be hacked. There was an incident in 2015 where 2 white-hat hackers commandeered a Jeep Grand Cherokee, and so that's caused some change in the rules. As cars become increasingly interconnected, are you concerned that cybersecurity could pose a threat to safety?
We are absolutely concerned about hacking and threats to cars as they become more and more computerized. And there needs to be some federal action on this to protect both the people in the car and all of us who are surrounding, including pedestrians, bicyclists, and other road users.
What steps are the automobile industry now taking to help prevent that?
I can't speak to what the auto industry is doing right now, but what I can offer is that there should be some federal requirements that cars are not enabled to be hacked to the best of the ability of the intelligence that is available now.
So is NHTSA taking steps?
Not to my understanding.
So then it's kind of up to Congress to do something.
That's, I would urge Congress to take steps to move this along.
Okay, I thank the witnesses and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back, and now I recognize Mr. Carter for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank all of you for being here. Very important information. Mr. Nordstrom, as Dr. Bouchon alluded to earlier, currently I'm the only pharmacist serving in Congress, and this is extremely important to me, particularly as it relates to medications and how they are impairing people, and particularly when they're operating machinery and especially cars and trucks and that type of thing. Do you see this on the rise? Do you see a rise in the rate of drug-impaired driving?
Yes, sir, absolutely. That, the National Roadside Survey found that 22% of drivers tested positive for illegal prescription or over-the-counter medication.
Now, illegal prescription, are these
This is
prescriptions?
illegal, prescription, or over-the-counter medication.
So they were prescribed to them.
So some of the time, yes, sir.
Okay, well, okay, let's just assume they were prescribed for them and they were taking them like they were supposed to be, but still, they shouldn't have been behind the wheel and using these medications.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely that happens.
Okay. Any idea of any factors that led to this increase or that have led to an increase? I mean,
You know, sir, we're, I don't need to tell a pharmacist how much more medication is being consumed in this country over
Right.
time. You know, I mean, when it comes to opioids, we know we're 4% of the world population. We consume about 80% of the world's opioids, right?
Right.
More and more people are taking medication, and they're doing all kinds of things, including driving, you know, and so there's certainly more of that happening.
outside of opioids and marijuana, any other particular medication, any other particular class or of medications that you see?
No, you know, I mean, obviously, when we're talking about medications, the other things that we would worry about are benzodiazepines.
Right.
And other sedative hypnotics.
Mm-hmm.
That can certainly impair judgment and performance.
Let me ask you specifically about marijuana. In full disclosure, I'm not a fan. I am absolutely, adamantly opposed to the recreational use of marijuana. Nevertheless, I understand there are states that have legalized it. Do you see an increase in impaired driving in those states?
From the data that we've seen coming out of, especially Washington, has done a really incredible job tracking their data, and it's one of the things that we would really encourage states to do is to look at Washington's example of measuring so that they can see.
So how are they measuring?
So what Washington actually did is they went back and they looked at blood samples from before they legalized for different crashes and cases so that they could see what happened pre and post. You know, so they have seen an increase, and I think it's just very important that other states, as they contemplate legalizing, that they think about doing that kind of rigorous measurement so that they can see what's happening after they make a change in policy so that they know then how they're going to respond.
Are there any tests out there? I mean, you know, we got a breathalyzer. We can test for alcohol. What about for marijuana? I mean, are there any? I'm not familiar with it. Georgia is not. It's not legal yet in Georgia, and I hope it won't be. But nevertheless, I'm just not familiar with it.
So there are oral fluid assays that can be done, and there are portable oral fluid kits that can be done at the roadside that look specifically for THC and active THC metabolites. And that's about as, apart from doing blood work and then GCMS, that's what we've got right now.
Okay. I don't mean to be redundant, and I came in on the tail end of Dr. Bouchon's questions, but in your testimony you mentioned there's a huge opportunity for collaboration with healthcare practitioners and pharmacists on this issue. What do you see as the collaborative process, and how can pharmacists play a role?
Well, I certainly think that the communication between physicians and pharmacists could always be better. You know, that as an addiction psychiatrist, I had great relationships with their pharmacists because frequently people would act one way in front of me, and then when they're in a retail setting, that they would act in a very different way, and they forgot that there was a licensed healthcare professional who's still assessing them. And so we would get very, very good information back from the pharmacists, and because we had them sign the HIPAA releases, we could speak with pharmacists. And so, I mean, I think that kind of communication, though, needs to really happen between prescribers, so not just physicians, but any prescriber, and the pharmacist on the dispensing end, to make sure that because if I made an oversight or an omission, the pharmacist would catch it, would call me, and we made sure that the communication was tight.
Great. Well, and when I was still practicing pharmacy, it was routine when I dispensed a medication. I'd tell them, look, this is going to make you drowsy. Be careful if you're driving. I mean, that was just routine of what we did for patient counseling.
And I think that's the kind of thing that we need to be doing more of,
Right.
sir.
Okay. Well, thank you very much,
Thank
and
you.
I yield back.
I now recognize Congresswoman Castor for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair, for calling this hearing on how we make our cars safer, and I want to thank the witnesses for sharing your expert points of view, and Ms. Livingston, thank you for sharing your very personal story of your wonderful parents. I'm sorry. Automobile defects were identified over 10 years ago. 10 years ago, the Society of Automotive Engineers identified the dangers posed by keyless ignition systems. 2 years later, NHTSA proposed a rule that would require automobiles to provide supplementary warnings when a driver inadvertently left a keyless ignition vehicle running. And yet, 8 years later now, there's still no final rule. The result has been at least 21 documented cases of people dying from carbon monoxide poisoning after accidentally leaving a keyless ignition vehicle running. Automobile defects that were identified over 10 years ago should not be causing deaths in 2019. Ms. Livingston, the vehicle that killed your parents was a 2017 Toyota Avalon, which was manufactured several years after automakers identified carbon monoxide hazards tied to keyless ignition systems, and several years after NHTSA proposed standards to reduce those risks. Do you believe that the auto industry failed to protect your parents? Do you believe that NHTSA failed to protect your parents?
Absolutely.
Ms. Chase, I'm concerned that NHTSA's hands-off approach to addressing safety issues like keyless ignition systems is costing lives. Why? 10 years, why has NHTSA not finalized the rule to protect the public? And it's going to take an act of Congress now to do this, but they've had all of the evidence. How can we ensure NHTSA proactively identifies and addresses these sorts of automobile safety issues?
You've identified the issue perfectly, and the inaction at the agency is why the Park It Act and other pieces of legislation that we've discussed today are critical, because it's not moving and people are dying. And there's technology that is existent and inexpensive that could be put in all cars today. So I urge this subcommittee and then to move these bills through, and let's get them to the floor and start saving lives.
So that's the Park It Act, and hopefully it will be moving. On the Hot Cars Act, a friend of mine, I went grocery shopping with a friend of mine recently. They have a new vehicle, and this is Tampa, Florida we're talking about. They wanted to make another stop at a different store, and I said, but you can't. Your groceries are going to bake, and they're going to be ruined. They said, no, look at this. In this vehicle, there is the temperature will, the air conditioning will come on as it's parked if the temperature in the car goes up too high. Is that one of the answers?
That is one of the answers. So what is needed is a detection system. So there must have been, in whatever vehicle that was, a detection system
If it
that
hit
found...
if it hit a certain temperature internal. internally, then the AC would come on for,
So that is one solution. So it has the detection system, it kicks in the AC, or it could also kick in the horn beeping, or, you know, you getting a notification on your phone. There are a number of different ways that this problem can be solved. And what's so critical about the hot cars bill is that it doesn't mandate one over the other. It just mandates that the problem be solved. And there are different ways, there are different innovators that can solve this problem, including the one that you just
and
mentioned.
we were just talking about groceries, but children are dying.
Children are dying,
So,
animals are dying, and it's unnecessary.
and again, it looks like it's going to take an act of Congress when it shouldn't. The agency should be more proactive.
I agree with you.
A person's gender should not determine whether he or she is injured or killed in an automobile crash, but researchers have found that women are 73% more likely to die or suffer severe injuries in a car crash than a man. And a study from the University of Virginia suggests that female crash dummies may contribute to this troubling trend. According to the study, female crash dummies do not appropriately account for the size and weight of an average woman. Inaccurate test dummies can lead to ineffective safety measures. Are you aware of this study, and what factors do you think are contributing to the discrepancy here between men and women in car crashes?
In honesty, I've read the highlights of the study, but not the extensive study some of my staff have. But I am aware of the problem, and there needs to be more different types of crash dummies that are more reflective of people's body sizes and weights, so that the equipment that is put into cars will be responsive and protect them as they should.
Thank you very much, and I hope, Madam Chair, you'll look into this with me. Thank you.
Fascinating questions and answers, or things that need to be answered. I now recognize Congresswoman Kelly for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to thank you and the ranking member for holding this hearing. It's so important. I, too, have left my car running, and both times, one time I was trying to make the train, and when I came back, I wonder why my gas was so low, and a second time I'd actually parked it under Cook County's building and left the car running all day. So I can relate to what you guys are saying. Ms. Livingston, you made a comment. Thanks for having the hearing, and you know it's a busy day today, but I could say on behalf of this committee, we're never too busy to save lives. That's what this committee is about, so thank you for being here. Safety should be a standard feature of every new vehicle, not an add-on that a consumer has to pay for. Your level of safety in your car should not depend on the size of your wallet, but many existing and emerging safety technologies such as automatic emergency brakes, rear automatic braking, blind spot detection, and lane departure warnings are sold as luxury items which must be purchased for an extra fee or as part of an expensive add-on package. These additional costs may put these life-saving technologies out of reach for many Americans. Automatic emergency brakes are not the same as leather seats. Lane departure warnings are not the same as a Bluetooth-enabled stereo. Do you believe that selling safety-enhancing features such as backseat warnings or a keyless ignition override as part of accessory packages with a bunch of other gear like luxury floor mats and wheel locks discourages consumers from buying cars with crucial safety features? Any of you can answer.
I could not have said it better than you just did, that these safety features should be in all new vehicles, and they should not be packaged with a moonroof or a heated steering wheel. They should be, these are proven technologies to reduce crashes, save lives, and prevent injuries. The only reason that they are not being put into all new cars now is that more money can be made from selling them as luxury packages, or they are in some high-end vehicles that not everyone can afford.
Sure. Either one of you, any comments?
I totally agree with you. These are things that are readily available, should be in every car. And we do need an act of Congress. That's just the way it is. And the car industries have proven over more than a decade that for keyless ignition that they haven't voluntarily put these protections in. And some say that it could be only 60 cents a car in that particular case. But to call things that are for safety a luxury is just wrong.
Well, ma'am, it's a bit outside my lane as the director of responsibility.org, but certainly, I mean, as a consumer, I couldn't find fault with a single word that's been said here.
And in the panel's opinion, are there certain advanced safety technologies that should no longer be an option but should be standard on all vehicles?
Obviously, the hot cars technology and the cutoff switch for the keyless ignition switch. Additionally, automatic emergency braking, lane departure warning, blind spot detection, just to name a few that have been proven by the Insurance Institute for Highway Safety to reduce crashes. We know that these are effective. They should be in all cars as standard equipment. And there should be performance standards for them so that if somebody calls something a particular name, we know that it will respond the way it is expected to.
Going back to watching people's pocketbooks, what do you think can be done to retrofit old cars? Everybody can't afford to buy a new car, or, you know, everybody can't afford some of the luxury cars.
I think there needs to be some more research and studies done on how retrofits can be affected. I can say in terms of the hot cars, have seen some aftermarket products. I don't know the verification of them, but I've seen them. And so the problem therein, though, is that no one really thinks that they're going to leave their child or that their child is going to climb in. So that would put it incumbent upon the consumer to go out and buy the aftermarket product. That's why it needs to be standard, so that people, you know, have that safety assurance without even thinking about it.
I just wanted to mention on the keyless ignition how both GM and Ford embraced going in and making a change and did a recall so that the older vehicles would have it put in. It's possible to do technically. I think Toyota's announcement that the new cars will have it is great. However, there are a lot of cars out there and they'll be on the road 7 or 8 years, and I think that a recall is in order for that so more people don't die.
Good idea. Madam Chair, yield back.
The gentlelady yields back, and I now recognize Mr. Rush for 5 minutes.
I want to thank you, Madam Chair, and the ranking member for conducting this hearing. It's been fascinating to witness, and I certainly want to join with all my colleagues in commending Ms. Livingston, whose courage and to take her pain and turn it into a pursuit of well-being for all Americans is totally commendable, and we certainly want to express our appreciation to you. You didn't have to do it, but you are doing it, and we thank you so much for it, for all your work and your efforts. Ms. Chase, in your testimony, you discussed the role that technology can play in an increasing vehicle and pedestrian safety. Specifically, technologies like the AEB, the automatic emergency braking, are an important factor in decreasing crash-related injuries. That's why I was pleased to see the 2016 voluntary agreement implementing AEB from 20 vehicle manufacturers. While NHTSA has announced that it will accelerate its research into advanced AEB systems that include pedestrian and bicyclist applications, they have not done enough. That is why this morning, I, along with 7 of my Democratic colleagues on the subcommittee, sent a letter to NHTSA asking for an update on implementation of this advanced technology. That being said, can you please expand upon why this technology is so important to pedestrian and bicyclist safety, and what other technologies should also be considered?
Well, Congressman, thank you for your leadership, and I look forward to reading your letter after the hearing is concluded. AEB is an essential piece of technology that should be in all cars because the problems of impairments, like we discussed, and distraction, among others, is prevalent in our motoring public. And AEB, if someone is distracted or impaired, will detect there is an object or person in front, hopefully a person, that's an advanced AEB system, is in front of them, and if a person doesn't brake, it will brake for them. I'd just like to make a side note about the voluntary agreement. While it may seem like a step forward. We really would like to see a minimum performance standard, because with a voluntary agreement, a company can walk away from it. A company can also call something a system, name it something, but we don't know how it truly performs. So we'd like to see the added step of it first being required as a standard equipment, and then also there being a minimum performance standard for the technology.
Thank you. Congresswoman Kelly asked a line of questions that I want to pursue. Most of my constituents don't have new cars. Most of them have used cars. And 5 years down the road, the cars that are online that will be purchased today and tomorrow will also be used cars. And cars that may or may not have this advanced technology. And I understand that there could possibly be devices that will be marketed to deal with some of these issues that we've been discussing. But what I would like you to inform this committee about is what role can the Congress play in addressing the issues of some of the older model cars in terms of how can we use this legislative perspective that we have to address the issues of older cars that are still a threat to life, limb, and safety.
Well, as the proud owner of a 15-year-old minivan, I hear you. And what I would encourage Congress to do is to find out what NHTSA is doing on this issue. And then also, I'd like to work with you and your staff to see if there are any legislative solutions to this problem, because it is a problem. There are a lot of used or secondhand vehicles on the road, and they should not be, they should have the advances that are available in new cars. So I look forward to working with you to see where we can go on this.
Thank you. Madam Chair, you're back.
I want to thank all of the witnesses. This was just really wonderful testimony today. Thank you for your participation. There's a lot of follow-up that we need to do. I want to remind members that pursuant to committee rules, they have 10 business days to submit additional questions for the record to be answered by witnesses who have appeared. And I want to ask each of the witnesses to please, if you get questions, to respond as promptly as possible to those questions. At this time, let's see, before that, so these are things I would ask unanimous consent to insert into the record. Where are we? Okay. We have a letter from the College Church, I'm sorry. Okay, we have a letter from Colleen Church, advisor and counsel to responsibility.org, a letter from the daughter of a carbon monoxide poisoning victim, a letter from the son of a carbon monoxide poisoning victim, a letter from the American Property Casualty Insurance Association. Is that it? So without objection, so ordered, and the committee is now adjourned.